Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 15. Sometimes people come into your life that gently change its direction, helping you chart a new course that is in alignment with your goals and aspirations. My guest today has done this for me. Tania Marien is an independent environmental educator and host of Talaterra podcast, a show where she highlights the work of freelance environmental professionals and the work they do in communities. Tania has been a guide and a mentor for me throughout the process of creating my own podcast, a gift for which I'm very grateful to her. Today we're talking about Tania's professional career as a freelance environmental educator herself and how she used art and creativity to connect people and plants, deepening their understanding of nature in the process. Tania, hi. Thank you so much for being here. This is very exciting for me.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's so fun. I'm going to give a little backstory about the way we know each other. So I found you because you have a podcast, Talaterra, and it's all about freelance environmental educators. And I found Talaterra because you interviewed John Muir Laws. And then I realized, whoa, here's a podcast with my tribe on it. I was so excited to find Talaterra. And so I started listening to all your episodes. And then once you had an episode explaining that you're opening a co-working space for freelance environmental educators. So I joined that very day. I was so excited. And then you and I connected. We started talking. And you invited me to be on Talaterra to talk about International Nature Journaling Week, which was so fun. And then we were talking about podcasting, and you inspired me to join up to Seth Godin's Akimbo workshop to learn podcasting, which I did. And there you were a coach on the course. So you have been absolutely a huge part of my development into creating this podcast. And on Talaterra, you have a signature question when you like to ask all your guests, and I'm going to be cheeky and I'm going to turn it back on you.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you, what is your earliest memory of enjoying nature?
I'll have to say it's images. It's of the backyard of the house where I grew up. So the images that I see right now that pop up for me are St. Augustine grass, 3 dogs, stumps from eucalyptus trees that we had in the backyard, a clothesline, the dog run, a really big old Santa Rosa plum tree. So that's fun. So that's what comes up for me.
Yeah,
it is playing in the backyard and playing with the dogs. And we used to have really tall eucalyptus trees in the back, and then they were cut down because of the winds, and they got to be too dangerous. They were too big. And so I used to sit on the trunk, climb into the trunk. I think, now as an adult, that trunk's probably not so big, but if it was big enough to step onto and into, that space where the trunk was split. And so I would sit on the back in that corner of the yard and sit on the trunk.
Being in trees as kids, for me as well, was just so amazing. Like that, a moment of stillness in the branches of a tree and reflecting on the world. Mm-hmm. It can be a really important place for reflection in a child's mind, can it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't know why I sat in that spot as much as I did. I don't remember what I was thinking.
Yeah.
But that was where I sat on that cut part of that trunk.
And did you always know you wanted to have nature as part of your career?
No, I didn't know that. back then, I certainly didn't know that. My dad was very much a plant person, and he's created bonsai all my life, and he learned from the bonsai masters, and he still does that. For he did have a deep interest in starting a nursery, and so this one man was selling his nursery, and my dad bought all of his Cymbidium orchids, and so I mean lots and lots of Cymbidium orchids, and I was always sitting in the back of a car surrounded by Cymbidium orchids.
That is so interesting.
And he still has his orchids. He doesn't have nearly as many as he did way back then. But so plants, I've always been around plants. And yeah, now that you ask, if you think back about it, that big old plum tree from the backyard, the neighbor's apricot tree had really good apricots, but a lot of it was over on our side, and so it would drop the apricots. We lived at the end of a driveway, and the lady, there was a woman who always used to hang Christmas stockings for my sister and myself on our side of the fence. She had this long, beautiful, rectangular, deep piece of property with pyracantha coming through the fence. So every time I see a pyracantha, I think of her fence. So there was always memorable, I guess, landmark plants around.
Yeah, I can see that you were talking about the plants that characterize a time or a person, and that's a beautiful connection between the plant and the event.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened? You went to university. Did you study plants?
I did. It was organismal biology, and so it was organismal biology, zoologies, and the botanies, and the ecologies, and those types of courses. And yeah, took a lot of plant courses back then. This was, in the 80s, right? In the late 80s. So it's been a while. Yes, and then grad school, my first project was a pollination ecology project. And then the hives didn't work out, and so I switched projects and did a student learning project, and ended up being an interdisciplinary project about biology and student learning. So yeah, so biology's been a consistent thread.
And then in 2002, you started ArtPlantae, a project aimed to increase botanical literacy and plant awareness in the public. Can you talk about ArtPlantae and what it involved?
Well, it was, when I went to school, my whole objective, what I wanted to do was teach at the community college, because my best college experiences had penned at the community college. I had fantastic instructors, and that's where I wanted to be. And so, I went through school, got into grad school, and then started teaching, as adjunct faculty. Of course, that started in grad school and then afterwards at a couple community colleges. But then I became a grumpy adjunct and a grumpy freeway flyer. And so I stopped, and I knew I didn't want to be in the classroom that way with being that grumpy and tired. And so I stopped doing that. And so I took some time off and just explored the things that I gravitated to naturally on winter break and summer break and spring break, when I wasn't grading papers and writing labs and that type of thing. And so I did culinary school, all this other stuff. Then one day my mom said, "Do you want to take this botanical art class with me at the Arboretum?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And so I took it with her, and then things just clicked. And then I became aware of just how much I had around me that was already centered around botanical art and illustration. I had a book about women illustrators, and that is just how it started. And then I was taking classes, and I would, watch people who are just highly skilled at, doing this elegant work and capturing plants on paper. But they were unfamiliar with the terminology and of all of the parts, the plant parts that they were drawing. And I ignored it. It was no big deal, so that part of that whole process was new to them, learning about paint was new to me. Okay, so
Interesting.
but then as I continued to take classes, I heard stamen, which are the male reproductive parts of the plants, called these thingies one too many times, and I thought, all right, I can fix this. I know how to fix this. And that's where ArtPlantae came from. And so it started as an artist herbarium. So
tell me about an artist herbarium. So what does that involve?
So it involved it started to become a database of sorts, a directory of different plant families. And so I would have a representative plant, and where I would then label all the parts. And then there was a section specifically for botanical illustrators. It was called What's Going On, so that it would be information that would be helpful to them specifically. Then I had a section about landscape plants, so to make a connection between that plant family and some common landscape plants that people might be familiar with. And then I had a little section on resources. So it was four different sections. But then I had photographs and then also some sketches and illustrations that were labeled, just to just to stop having stamen being called these thingies. That was my
pet peeve.
Yeah, that is what drove the whole thing.
I love that story. Oh my goodness. And was it picked up well by botanical artists? Did it help their ID?
I think it was helpful to some. I mean, it didn't become the massive database that I had wanted it to be, but it did receive some recognition, and some people appreciated it. There was a mention of it in the Journal for the American Society of Botanical Artists, way back when. And so that was nice that it was, it was useful. It was being deemed useful or thought of as useful. Back then, this was before I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about creating web pages. Yeah. And I had started to build my own web page. I took a course specifically on how to do web pages, and then my very skilled, and talented friend, she goes, "Let me just see what you have." And so it was horrid, okay, compared to what she was capable of. And so she helped me, and so
that's a learning curve,
a steep learning curve, and that AP even got out of my head. It's all because of my friend Deborah. She made that possible. So
so then it started to expand, right? Because you did lots of outreach, and you were doing fairs and museums and education classes, botanical gardens, where you would help the public connect with plants. Can you talk about some of those things that you did with the public?
Yeah, so I had one of the things that I did. Well, let me first say that a component of the educational website, a complement to the site, was a bookstore, resources, and so different things for people to learn about art, plants, science, children's books. I mean, all sorts of different things. And so I would do events like environmental education fairs and garden shows and book festivals for families, or events for teachers and librarians.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and so at, say, an environmental education fair, I would have painting stations, or I would have some type of interactive activity where the kids and the adults as well would learn about whatever plant or whatever the subject it would happen to be for that theme for that given time. And so I did a lot of activities like that, but I've also did STEM events, so like a Pi Day event. I did Fibonacci blunts for Pi Day, and Girl Scout events, and things like that. I used to do, and I also used to travel with a big traveling sketchbook, and people would sketch in there. I would have a prompt, the same prompt that I would use at all of the events, and that's a article in itself. I haven't ever gone through that to identify how many how many plants, and what kind of plants were drawn. Because
so they would be drawing in the same sketchbook, and then you would take it to the next place.
Yeah, and they everyone received the same prompt. I never changed the sign, what the sign said. And so, but I was always busy with talking with other people and stuff. But when I would glance, I would see roses and daisies and houses with front yards with plants or whatever, all sorts of different things. And so I've always wanted to go through all the pages, document every sketch that's in there, and just to see what that single prompt
Do you remember what the prompt was?
The prompt that everyone received was, please doodle in the guest sketchbook. Chicken scratch preferred. Words not necessary. Select any page. That was the same. Yeah, that's the prompt that everyone received.
I love it. Yeah, that would be so interesting to go back and see how everyone interprets that one prompt.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's an article or post or whatever's going to come of it that I've always wanted to write. Yeah.
Absolutely. I saw some of your photos, and one of the activities that you did was an Earth Day puzzle. Can you talk about the Earth Day puzzle? Because that looked so much fun.
Yes, yeah. That event was for that particular year. It was for Earth Day, and so I would do it at different locations. And the theme, of course, I would tweak the theme a little bit between venues. But it was a puzzle. There was large blank pieces, and everything had a Earth Day theme. And so then the parents or the kids or whoever would be able to illustrate a piece and then add it to the puzzle. And what that experience taught me is that if this particular kit that I bought, you can add to it and add to it and add to it. At one event where there's 1,200 kids who come through in about 4-hour time period, I just let it grow and let it go. Well, wow. It gets a little bit unruly.
I bet.
And so then at the events after that, I had like 5 different themed puzzles to try to keep the pieces contained and similar to these different puzzles that were being made. But that was a very good activity. It was fantastic. Yeah.
There's so much in that because you're having them produce something with their own thoughts and feelings and identifying with plants, but also then that sort of metaphorical idea that we're all part of the puzzle and your piece goes in with the rest and it makes the whole picture. That's a really powerful metaphor too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Because some kids would look to see what was already there and then build on to an image. That was absolutely going on. Yeah. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about plant blindness, and in fact, I'm going to check myself because I've just listened to your most recent Talaterra episode where your guest, and her name is Catherine Parsley, she is making a case for changing the name of this phenomenon, plant blindness, to plant awareness disparity, so as not to use a disability metaphor with a negative connotation. But I'd love for you to talk about plant blindness or plant awareness disparity and what it is and how art can help reduce this plant blindness.
Yes. Well, in the most straightforward way, the plant awareness disparity, I'm going to start using the term, Kate's term, it describes the fact that people are more familiar with animals than they are with plants because they tend not to notice the plants in their environment. Okay, that is at the root of all this. And I was using drawing as a learning tool when I started ArtPlantae because it was, well, one, I'm a very visual learner, and so I knew the benefits of learning that way, and that's how I studied for tests and exams, and how I got through all the botanies and all of the dissections and the zoology classes and everything. That's just how I thought. That's how I thought through things and studied. So because of that experience, those experiences, that's how I started, ArtPlantae. And so the benefits of drawing plants, it's to slow people down, to see what's really there, to understand processes, to understand structure, understand relationship, because it's more than just leaf, stem, flower petal. From that you become, because you just use that as a springboard to learning about pollination syndromes and growth and habits and terminology. Botanists are big on terminology, and so all of those root words and combining forms, because you had that I had that, and botany students have that, science students, and so that's how all that gets solidified in your head. And so it's really a way of providing a visual explanation. You are doing more than doodling or sketching. You are learning the processes that are related to that structure.
Yeah, I think even just, like you said, taking the time to sit with the plant, because we do tend to have the plants in a scene as the backdrop, and then the players in the play that we're looking at are the animals that are in that scene. And to sit with a plant, to look at it deeply, makes it a player in the scene rather than just a backdrop. And your guests in the most recent podcast talked about science communication and how it isn't just about passing on knowledge, it's about building empathy and love for something. And I think that that's exactly what you were doing through passing on this love of art and connecting that with plants.
Yes, and it is more accessible. It's an accessible way to all of that, path to that.
One of the activities I saw on your photos from ArtPlantae days was a little sheet that said, "I'm a scientific illustrator," and then the idea, I guess, was to draw under that. Can you talk about that little activity?
Yes. So that was a sticker. It's a 3x3 inch sticker that I made, and this activity was first designed specifically for a Pi Day event, and it was at.
Before you go on, can you explain a Pi Day?
Pi Day is for Pi 3.14. And
okay.
Yeah, and so it was for that event. It happened to be March 14th, 2015. And the time, I forget the rest of the numbers, little in sequence, but it was aligned perfectly for that particular day, and so that's why they made a little extra bigger deal out of it. And so it was at a community college, and it was also a career event. And so for the vendors who were involved, they needed to address a STEM, something that was related to science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and also have a career element to it.
Okay.
And so I chose Fibonacci, and to talk about the Fibonacci sequence and the spiral, and had different tables set up. One was, here you get to learn about the concept, and another one is here you get to try, learn about how scientific illustrators do it, because scientific illustrators was the career component that I incorporated into that. And so then at one point in that whole interactive activity, the kids would get a 3x3 sticker, and then they would apply what they learned about spirals and how to look at pineapples and artichokes and all that, and to a sketch of one of the things that were on the table. And so they would sketch it out, and then they would peel off the sticker and wear it and say, "I'm a scientific illustrator."
Fantastic.
Right? Yeah. And so they would identify with that. And so that is what that activity was about. And that component, the "I'm a scientific illustrator" part, I did it at a Girlderness event. Girlderness was a Girl Scout event.
Girl Scout. Well,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it was for the Girl Scouts to earn a badge. And then I was simplified even more, shortened even more to a 15-minute activity at a career events specifically for Girl Scouts in the local mountains here and at a Girl Scout camp. And so I got a lot of play out of that activity. Yeah.
I really like that. And, it's because I think that often we think, and especially as kids, that science is something other people do, or being a naturalist is something that was done in history, or even scientific illustration, something someone else does. And I love that because it makes it real. Like, if you're illustrating science, you're a scientific illustrator.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. Slap it right down there. If you're doing it, you are it,
Yeah. And I have, throughout all of those many years that I was doing that, I made it a point to bring attention to the work that scientific illustrators did, and made it a point to bring attention to all the ways we learned from them. Because when I was in school, I never knew that was an option. And so that was my motivation, was to bring attention to that throughout everything that I did. Because we've learned so much from scientific illustrators, right? On interpretive panels, in journals, in newspapers, on the web, in museums, at zoos and nature centers. And we just learn from them everywhere. We just don't know it.
Yeah, it's easy to take the information from an interpretive sign, say, and not really pay enough attention to, someone actually built this, someone actually put a paintbrush down on the paper and created this beautiful illustration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've heard you talk about artist trading cards, and I haven't come across them here, and I'd love for you to explain what an artist trading card is.
Oh, artist trading cards are fun. Okay, so they are the same size as baseball cards.
Okay.
But they're blank, and they're made of different types of art papers, and you can design them, any way that you want. And I've forgotten the year, but there was an artist who had an participatory event, an interactive exhibition, where he cut up a bunch of cards that were that size, and that's how they got their start, and that's how he engaged with the public. And they are the best tool for events. You could use them in all sorts of different ways. And how I used them was, I used to have a large magnetic board that traveled with me, and the rule was take one, leave one. Okay. And so, because at events, ideally, if there were a group of kids or a family who came up, then they could exchange cards with each other. But oftentimes at events, it's one child, with their mom or their dad, and so there wasn't always someone around who they were comfortable trading with. And so the deal was, take one, leave one. And you know what? And that activity showed me just how generous children are. They so want to leave something nice for somebody else. And they're just all about that. And so they would, whatever the theme was, whatever the prompt was that I gave them, and they would put up their card, and then they'd look and they'd take this one. And then they'd happily walk away with that amazing one. And take that home. I love that.
It's such a treasure it's a joy to put something you've created up there, but a little treasure to take home as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That sounds like so much fun.
Yeah, it is. It is a lot of fun.
So you've talked about how you did some botanical art courses. I'm interested in your personal art practice and your personal nature journaling practice. Do you keep a nature journal now, aside from what you did with ArtPlantae?
When I do journal, doodle, it is just for me to think something through.
Okay.
Or, it's really just something light to think something through. I don't do it like you do it or your guests, do it. Although I have to say, though, after I went to Wild Wonder last year, I came home, I thought, because my area doesn't have a nature journal club. And I said, oh, yeah, you can do that. No, you don't want to do that. my project was in an entirely different spot then. I said, no, you can't take that on. You don't do that. And
Starting a
then-
club, you mean?
Yeah, starting a club.
Okay.
That is spread over 2 counties.
Yeah.
And then after this year's virtual event, I thought, then the IT came back. And it's been sitting there. And so, but no, to answer your question, no, I'm not like I used to.
Yeah.
In front of the TV, maybe sometimes I'll, bring my stuff down and sit on the floor and all that. But
so when I was going through the podcasting workshop that you were a coach on, one of the prompts that we had to do was to create a list of questions for guests that we might potentially ask on the podcast. And so you were one of the first to see my my question list, and one of the questions that I had on there and that I have been asking guests was, do you nature journal from the head or the heart? And when I put this on the podcasting workshop, you said that you have an answer for that for yourself, and I'd love to ask you that. When you do nature journal, do you nature journal from the head or the heart?
It is definitely more from the head, and that's just because of my background. Because, as I said, for me, it was always been a thinking tool. And when I was teaching, if I would have to teach a process, I would draw out parts of the process across the entire length of the whiteboard, but leave blanks intentionally that we would fill in that parts of the story, in class. And so for me, it's definitely been it's always been a thinking from the head, more from the head.
How do you use it as a thinking tool? What is it that you that drawing things out just helps process something in your brain?
Yeah, it helps me understand what I'm looking at, or think about something that I'm curious about. And matching colors though is a challenge, and so that's very much a head thing. That's not so much heart thing, right? It's like, what is that? Or seashells or something. There's lots of nooks and crannies and rough edges to seashells, and so I'll sketch something like that out. It's definitely from the head. I wish sometimes it wasn't.
No, I mean, that's perfect. There's no right answer to that question. There's no best answer. I'm just interested in the different ways that people approach nature journaling and nature art. Yeah. And the different reasons. Yeah, there's no right answer.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Do you have favorite materials that you use?
So when I started, it's always been graphite. I really like graphite and carbon dust. I really like carbon dust. Yeah, so pencil, really taking the pencil. I like the black and white and the gradations of tone. And colored pencils, I used to know my colored pencils very well. I mean, better than I do now. I mean, really understood them. I made several attempts to learn how to paint like a contemporary botanical artist, but that's just not me. I don't have the temperament for that.
Yes, it's very precise, isn't it?
Yeah, it's precise, and I don't have the temperament, the patience to watch paper dry. I mean, that's just not my thing. But all the dry media, I do like that. Yeah.
Tell me about carbon dust. I haven't come across that before.
So carbon dust is something that scientific illustrators use, the medical illustrators often. And you take like a piece of sandpaper, and then you take softer carbon pencils, and so you create the dust, okay? And then you have these little batches of dust, and you take really soft brushes, so like cosmetic brushes. So you make with the vellum, a heavier vellum, you make like a stencil type. And then you just brush it over it, and it looks like for a very long time you aren't depositing anything on this paper until you lift up your stencil, and then you see what you're making. And I learned it many years ago. It's one of the first things I learned, and it was very, very simple, but you can have very layered textures. And so the scientific illustrators, you'll often see, if you go skulls, bones, insects, beautiful beetles, things that were done in carbon dust.
I'm going to look into that.
Yeah.
That sounds so interesting.
Yeah. Yep. And then it becomes a puzzle to layer things because you have to build your stencil.
Yeah.
See, it's a head thing.
Yeah. It's the scientist in you. That sounds so cool.
Yeah.
So Talaterra podcast and your co-working space for freelance environmental educators, which is now called the Trailhead, are part of what you call the Freelance Condition and Lifelong Learning in Communities project. I'd love for you to explain more about your new endeavour and how your path has changed now.
Yes, I came to this project because when I was doing, ArtPlantae, I would cross paths with people who were also working independently. But because we would do events, and when you do events, you are unloading your car, you're pitching your canopy, you're doing what it is you're there to do, and then you're packing things up, and then you're gone. And so I never had a chance to talk to anybody. But I always knew, there's people who do this, and I would hear grumblings at conferences about other people who were interested in maybe more support from the organizations that they belong to. So I sat with that for a while, but then I decided to, when AP had run its course, I said, okay, well, I'm going to go explore this now. And and I did. I actually poked at this topic a little bit in 2015, so with a different mentor who I was working with, and I let it rest. I would consider it, and then I put it down, and consider it and put it down, and then I finally did it in January of 2018. I started to do it with intention, and I took the Alt MBA, and that made me feel okay. I think I know what I'm doing. And so then I started talking to people and created a survey and have had conversations with others like me and others who work in that capacity, ever since. And so the objective here is to bring attention to the work that these individuals do in their communities. My assertion is that the freelance educators are uniquely positioned to create change in their communities because they can move through their communities. They aren't bound to a site or to a building. And what I've found through my survey is that these individuals are definitely working in all sorts of different ways and different venues within communities. So it's not just museums and nature centers and zoos, but it's community centers and senior centers and all sorts of different ways. And so I want to bring attention to their work, and then also demonstrate that these individuals make good community partners. So these aren't seasonal hobbyists. These are very serious professionals. And so bring attention to their work, show that they're good community partners, and through all that, elevate their status with others in the field who might not give them a second thought. And then the long-term goal here is to make this type of work in freelance environmental education a more sustainable career choice.
And one really valuable thing you do is connecting people together. How can people get involved if there's freelance environmental educators listening to this?
Well, they could go to the Talaterra website, which is talaterra.com, and you'll see in the navigation header, if you go to community, that takes you straight to the community site, to the trailhead. And there's, of course, a navigation link to the podcast and to which is a little bit about the background of the project and yeah.
Tania, thank you so much for talking to me. It's amazing to turn the tables on you. And I've been on Talaterra a couple of times, and it's fun to chat with you and hear the backstory. And you have just been such an important part in my journey to getting to this point. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your interest and for having me revisit AP. It's such a big part of my life because never walking away. You should see my botanical art and botany library. I'm not walking away from that subject, but it's definitely part of who I was and am. So thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this chat with Tania. If you're a freelance professional working in a natural resource field or environmental education, definitely investigate Talaterra podcast and The Trailhead, which is an open forum for independent environmental education professionals. You'll find all the links to Tania's work in the show notes for this episode. Thank you very much for listening. See you next week.